This video is sponsored by World Anvil. This is an installment in my video series where I tackle a subject in D&D that some game masters ban, and we discuss the pros and cons of doing so, to help you figure out whether you should ban them in your own games. Today we're tackling alignments. Now the main question of this video is whether you should ban individual alignments that may cause some friction at the table. But before we can answer that question, I guess we should discuss whether you should ban alignment in general. I've made a few videos about alignment, you can check them out here, but in my most recent video on the subject, I discussed how alignment is really only useful if you and your players are using alignment descriptively rather than prescriptively. That is to say, alignment can be useful to figure out what your character would do in a given situation and how they feel about the world, but when your character's behavior no longer matches that alignment, but still feels authentic and believable for where they are in their journey, don't change the character, just change the alignment. Now that's kind of oversimplified. Alignment has the potential to be a lot more useful than that, and I've got more alignment videos coming in the future, so stay tuned for those. But just based on the description I gave, I can totally understand why some GMs just ban alignment. After all, 5e backgrounds give you all these other personality traits which can absolutely replace alignment. So long as Wizards of the Coast keeps publishing those sorts of backgrounds, then we don't need alignment, right? Well, I've already talked about D&D's backgrounds in another video, but yeah, as long as you have other methods for players to understand their characters and play them authentically, then it's true, you don't really need alignment. But it can also be a useful tool if your players want to use it as a way to think about their characters. And for the rest of this video, we sort of have to assume that you are using alignments in general, so for the purposes of this discussion, let's assume that, yes, your players use alignment, and you don't ban the concept from your games entirely. That still doesn't mean that you should necessarily allow every alignment. One of the most common practices regarding alignment across the history of D&D is the banning of evil alignments. Mainly, GMs ban evil alignments to cut down on disruptive behavior from players. Again, historically it has not been uncommon for some players, especially new players or young players, to write down that their character is evil, and then just start doing a bunch of rude or distracting or disruptive or frustrating or upsetting things during games. And when asked, hey, what are you doing? They'll respond, I'm just playing my character. So rather than leaving that option on the table for these players to use as a get-out-of-jail-free card to describe their character doing nasty stuff, a lot of game masters just said, nope, no evil characters. And let's play devil's advocate here. There's absolutely an argument for banning evil alignments. I mean, even setting aside all the reasons we just talked about, which are totally valid, D&D in general has shifted toward heroic fantasy storytelling across the past few editions, particularly 4th edition and 5th edition. In 4th edition, the player's handbook even essentially said the evil alignments were not intended for player characters. Quote, if you choose an alignment for your character, you should pick either good or lawful good. Unless your DM is running a campaign in which all the characters are evil or chaotic evil, playing an evil or chaotic evil character disrupts an adventuring party and, frankly, makes all the other players angry at you. Now, in fairness, 4th edition did a lot of strange things with alignment. We'll talk about that a bit later, and honestly, I may have to make a whole other video about that. But I also think, just like many of the more controversial changes in 4th edition, this recommendation came from behavior they saw in the hobby and just codified in the rules. And when the community had a habit of banning evil alignments, Wizards of the Coast applied that behavior to 4th edition, which was the most heroic fantasy version of the game. Of course, people don't like being told that they can't do the thing most of them already were not doing, so that's just one of the many elements of 4e that was really poorly received. But arguably, D&D has been trending toward heroic fantasy ever since the publication of the Dragonlance novels and adventure modules. So if you're telling heroic fantasy stories, then there is an impulse to make the characters heroic, to encourage them to be good, or at least not actively evil. After all, evil campaigns are their own thing, so the existence of an evil campaign implies the existence of good campaigns. Except, first of all, no, it doesn't. Sorry, I know that's a whole meme, I hate it so much. I know most of them are just jokes, but also, no, that's actually not how language works. But second, let's actually double back. Remember what I just said about how D&D has been trending toward heroic fantasy stories ever since Dragonlance? So to help fulfill that narrative goal, GMs would ban evil alignments? Well, there's a pretty strong irony here. Because in the actual Dragonlance novels that arguably kicked off this trend, the character of Raceland is heavily coded very early on as probably being evil. I mean, he wears the robes of the neutral wizards, but this is not a spoiler. Even in the first few chapters of the first book, he says a lot of deeply sinister things. None of his friends trust him to not do evil things. Everyone seems to think he's evil, and he doesn't really ever deny it. So there's an irony here that Dragonlance paved the way toward the version of D&D we know today, and yet they have a probably evil character who works with them and is still genuinely helpful and works towards the group's goals. So the books are basically telling us that, yes, not only are evil player characters part of the history and the culture of D&D, But there's no reason you can't have an evil character in a group that isn't just trying to get a bunch of treasure and isn't just gonna go stab their friends just to be edgy. An evil character can still have their own selfish goals, but can also be trusted to use those goals as a justification to do helpful things and be a part of a team on a heroic adventure. In theory, Raceland can act as the template for showing how to play an evil character in a heroic game. But of course, Raceland was a character in a work of fiction, so of course he didn't do anything disruptive. The writers didn't want him to be disruptive, and they had full control over the narrative. And when they did want him to be disruptive, they could determine that as well. Contrast that with a player character. Now, some players are really good at reading the campaign and understanding how far along their character's journeys should be and how to line those up with the timeline of the campaign. And other players might not worry about character arcs at all, but they do think about what they can do to make sure their character will work well enough with the other players so as not to cause any friction or drama. But that isn't true for every player. And if you don't feel like you can trust your players to behave responsibly if they play an evil character, then I can see the argument behind banning the evil alignment. Now, if you are trying to write a work of fiction, like the Dragonlance books, or even just keep track of the information that you've created for your setting, you're probably going to need some sort of resource where all that information can be stored, so you can access it at any time. And you know who does that? World Anvil. And you might want to make it so the players who you're not sure if you can trust can't read the lore you don't want them to see yet. So you want some way to put that lore into the article, but in a way the players can't see when they read it. And you know who has that feature? World Anvil. And if you don't trust your players, then you might not trust them to roll their own dice. So maybe you want to run your game virtually through some sort of website. And you know where you can do that? World Anvil. And if you want to save some money, you can visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK for 40% off of any annual membership. Once again, that's worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. Now, setting aside the evil alignment, let's move on to the other most controversial alignment, chaotic neutral. And once again, let's talk about Dragonlance. Even though he seems evil and plenty of characters say they can't trust him, Raceland is also frequently identified as neutral. Sure, he says a lot of sinister stuff, but he's always helpful. You can make the case that he's not evil, or at least his behavior isn't. He might actually be chaotic neutral, which, incidentally, and again ironically, is the other alignment that some game masters might be tempted to ban. Now, I should clarify, I don't actually know if any game masters do ban the chaotic neutral alignment, but I bet a lot of them are tempted, because this alignment also gets misused a lot. I talked about this in my last alignment video, but some players use the chaotic neutral alignment as an excuse to just do random stuff. Now, this behavior might not be as disturbing as the evil behavior, since a lot of evil character behavior can be truly heinous, but being random and zany can still be really frustrating and disruptive. There are some people who perceive chaotic to be the same as random, and yeah, in some contexts that's true, just not this one. But that doesn't stop them from just being unpredictable and wild and halting the game and stomping on the fun of the other people at the table. And the fact that so many chaotic neutral player characters can be potentially just as disruptive and frustrating as an evil character is actually really revealing. It's possible, dare I say even likely, that the alignment isn't actually the problem. Some players just want to do their own thing, play out their own fantasies, enjoy the thrill of being untethered in a way that they can't be in the real world. And there are ways to play these sorts of characters without creating friction with the rest of the group. We can see two of these examples in Critical Role, with Laura Bailey's Campaign 2 character and Ashley Johnson's Campaign 3 character. Both of them are pure id, but they're also not generally disrupting the game or breaking the flow or derailing the plot, and certainly not being disrespectful of the other players and their agency. But problem players don't take these same sorts of considerations. They'll steal important stuff from important NPCs just because they can. They'll refuse to take the bait on plot hooks no matter how much work you do to give them justifiable motivations. They'll potentially do other stuff that will get me demonetized if I talk about it on YouTube. And if they write evil on their character sheet, then they'll claim that they're just playing their character. But if you tell your group that evil alignments are off the table, these sorts of players will just write chaotic neutral instead, and explain that their character is chaotic, which is very conveniently gives them an excuse to do anything they want, including evil stuff. And if you tell your group that the chaotic neutral alignment is off the table, then these sorts of players write true neutral, and explain that their character doesn't care about anybody or anything, not unlike a sociopath in a movie, which very conveniently gives them an excuse to do anything they want, including evil stuff. And so on, and so on. The specific alignment isn't the problem with these sorts of players. They will find whatever justification they can to play the game however they want. I mean, heck, I didn't even touch on how the lawful good alignment had such a negative reputation for decades. They were basically perceived as the fun police, standing in the way of certain types of role-playing scenes just because their character wouldn't do that, because they had such a rigid idea of what the alignment meant. And this was exacerbated by the fact that paladins had to be lawful good, so if you wanted to play one of the character classes, you had to play an alignment that everybody expected to be disruptive. It was taken as common wisdom that you would just have to find a way to justify keeping your friend's lawful good character out of earshot if you wanted to lie or steal or torture, even if it was for the greater good. Now, the most frustrating lawful good characters were not usually performing the same types of disruptive actions as some evil or chaotic neutral player characters, but they still had this reputation of basically forcing the rest of the group to do something or not do something because of their own code. Which again means these players were basically derailing entire campaigns and taking agency away from other characters. The form of the behavior was different, but the root of the problem was fundamentally the same: a lack of respect for the other people at the table. Now, I don't think everyone who played their alignment the way they expected it to be played was a bad player or a problem player, but once again, I don't think the alignment itself was entirely to blame for every example. That being said, I totally understand if you still feel like you want to ban a couple of the more problematic alignments from your table. I basically used to do the same thing. When I first started running games, I told my players that they could not play evil characters. After all, that was the common wisdom in the RPG hobby at the time. At least, that's what I heard recommended in my little corner of the hobby. So that's what I did. But a few years later, in one of my games, I killed my first player character, which is a heck of a story, and it's one I'll have to tell another day. But as they were making their replacement character, they told me that they wanted to play a drow pirate who was lurking in the adventure location already. I can't actually remember if the drow pirates were already part of the adventure and he saw them and thought, hey, maybe I could play one of those, or if I added the drow pirates in because he had the character idea, but ultimately it doesn't matter that much. The point is, he wanted to play a drow pirate and he asked if he could play an evil character. And I debated whether or not I was going to let him do that. I believe I asked him what he had in mind when it came to the evilness of his character, and we talked about it. His character was devoted to his pirate captain, and she was probably not a very nice person. But this was a heroic fantasy game. They were trying to escape a weird magic city. They were fighting snake men and solving conspiracies. And so, of course, the pirates' goals were aligned with the party's. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And if I'm honest, it probably helped a lot that this player had already been in my game for several sessions by this point. I knew that he was not disruptive, and he pretty much understood my style as well, just as well as any of my other players did. And to be fair, that player is also a writer, so he might be particularly inclined toward understanding narrative demands and making sure his characters are able to justify their continued participation within the plot, possibly more so than the average player. But the point is, I told the player that they could play an evil character, and nothing bad happened. I mean, the game eventually fell apart because I ran out of free time and I burned myself out, but if I'm honest, that really did not have much to do with the fact that one of my players had rolled up an evil character. But while the game was going, the player made sure his character had a reason to work with the group. Once the first arc ended and they all escaped from the weird magic city, suddenly the reason to work together wasn't there anymore. But the player clearly still wanted a justification to keep playing with the rest of the group, because while his character held an evil ideology, the player did not have any desire to be disruptive. A few years ago, when I was starting a Curse of Strahd campaign, another one of my friends asked if they could play an evil character as well, and gave me the pitch for his PC, and I said yes without even really worrying about it. And this wasn't just a player who I'd played with, but who I'd also spent a lot of time talking with about D&D and Critical Role. So once again, I felt like he knew my style, and I had a good sense that he wasn't going to abuse the alignment and disrupt the game. And what's funny is that this character's dynamic with the group is actually really similar to the Raceland dynamic we talked about earlier. He will often say something very creepy or sinister, and then the other players talk about how much they can't trust him. But when the crap hits the fan, the evil character always fights for the group. He's just willing to do things that the other player characters are not in order to protect them. He's willing to do all sorts of evil things in order to keep his friends safe, and he has no illusions about whether or not these things are bad. But he very much believes the ends justify the means. I don't think we can debate whether or not that's an evil character. I mean, I guess we can. People can debate anything on the internet, and feel free to, actually. Comments are below. Engagement, engagement, engagement. But the point is, the character's completely compatible with the group, and is also definitely evil. It's totally doable. But ultimately, this is a conversation about player trust. And I could sit here and say, well, I guess I just trust my players. I must believe in the goodness of humankind, and if you don't believe your players can play an evil character and still be respectful towards the other players, then you're a cynic. But that is not my point at all. Because if you'll recall, both these players were people I already knew really well as individuals. Additionally, they'd already played with me before, and in one case, we'd also talked a lot about the kinds of actual play games we enjoy. And in both cases, they still kind of had to pitch me on how the alignment would be compatible with the rest of the group. Now, I don't think either of these conversations were super in-depth. I mainly just wanted to know that they'd considered how an evil character could work well in a team game. But that's still kind of telling, isn't it? The burden of proof is on the evil character's player to sell the GM on why they wouldn't be disruptive. We don't ask other folks who want to play other alignments if they're going to be able to play their character responsibly. And as we discussed earlier, problematic players can excuse their behavior with any alignment, if they even attribute their actions to their character's alignment at all. But on the other hand, yes, we do. We have session zeros for a lot of reasons, but at least in part, we do so to make sure that players know what is expected of them, and what sort of behavior won't be tolerated. But sure, if I'm playing with a stranger and they say they want to play an evil character, I'm definitely going to have some follow-up questions. And yeah, that is a bit of a double standard. But I'm also willing to allow people to play evil characters if I know that they've thought about how to integrate that character into a team game. And honestly, if their answers make me think that they aren't responsible enough to play an evil character, then it's pretty likely that there are some other warning signs as well, and that player might just not be the right fit for my table at all. Because if you're going to play an evil character, I want to know that you're still going to have some respect for the other players at the table, and you're going to respect their time and their goals. And if I don't get that sense from you, then, once again, the alignment might not be the problem. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, bell, the whole thing. If you want to give me money, you know how to do that too. Patreon, tiers, rewards. If you want to hang out with other cool people who enjoy having thoughtful conversations about these videos, you know where to go. Discord, server, community. If you want to see me record future videos or play video games like Hades, you know where to find me. Twitch, follow, subscribe, obey. And if you want updates about the things I have to share, you know what to sign up for. Newsletter. I don't send updates that often, but you should still sign up anyway. And if you want to watch a video where I create 5 D&D characters based on completely random prompts, click right here. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, play fair and have fun.